Thank you, Austin. Next up, we have Jason.
Evan, you good? Alright guys, my name is Melancon. Today I'll be talking about turbochargers versus superchargers. So what are these? So what they are forced induction for internal combustion engines. What they do is they just cram more compressed air into your engine so you can get a bigger combustion. They allow the engines to become more efficient and more powerful. And then what they do that by creating boost pressure. They're cramming compressed air into the engine bay, which means you're going to have more pressure, which the way they measure it is boost, is how much more pressure you have over atmospheric. So it's gauge pressure. Here's just an example of some. Here's a twin turbo system, and then here is a supercharger on top of another vehicle. Alright, so turbochargers. They are turbine-driven forced induction. As I said earlier, they increase power and efficiency. Turbos can increase power from 35 to 55% depending on the size of them and what engine they are on. They're powered by the exhaust gas already created from the engine, so they are very efficient for what you're using them for. They usually do high boost because they can spool up to higher speeds than what we'll see in the supercharger. And the way they're sized is, there's two sides of it. There's a compressor side and a turbine side. So the turbine side is the one on the back, that's where the gas goes through, which I'm about to explain. And then the compressor side is on the front that pulls in the air. So the components of a turbocharger. So as you can see here, you have your engine and exhaust gas will come out. Then it'll go into the turbine side, which will spin this shaft, which will then pull in air from the compressor side, and it'll compress it, and it brings in a lot of air, so it's cooler and it's compressed, so it's denser. Then, to keep it even colder, it goes through an intercooler right here, which will be in the front of the engine, and that will cool it down more, and then that goes into the cylinders, which will compress and then make more power. So here's a dyno chart of a turbocharger. This is power versus your engine RPM. This is how they see how vehicles perform. And as you can see, it's kind of a gradual and slow increase in the power as you increase RPM. And that's because you have to have so much exhaust gas before your blades can start spinning fast enough to pull in a lot of air. So this is what kind of creates lag, which I'll talk about. So you have to get to a certain RPM speed before you start seeing the real benefits of the turbo. So pros and cons, like I said, increases horsepower and torque. You can get better fuel economy because you're using already used exhaust gases to spin it so you can get more air into your cylinder. High top end horsepower, like I said, it works really well at high RPMs, and it's efficient, like I said, using the exhaust gases. Some cons, you have turbo lag. You have to get to a certain RPM before you will get the response from the turbos or get boost. So you'll have that, and that goes in hand with the throttle response. You might step on the gas, and it might take a little bit before you start feeling the power from the turbo. And also they're expensive. You have more components. You have the intercooler, the piping, the blow-off valve, a whole bunch of different things, so the price can be pretty expensive. Now we're on to superchargers. So superchargers are belt-driven forced induction. They use the crankshaft from the engine to spin the supercharger. It increases power and efficiency. You can see between 40 and 55% increase in power. So there's two types. There's centrifugal and then there's positive displacement supercharger. Centrifugal and prochargers, what we see down here, it's basically a belt-driven turbo, but I'm not going to focus on that. What I'm going to focus on is the twin screw. So in the positive displacement superchargers, there's two. There's a twin screw and a root. They're basically the same, just the rotors inside have different shapes. I'm just going to be talking about the twin screw for time's sake. And then the sizing of these, it's all about how much air is moved for one turn of revolution, and it's measured in liters. You can have a 2 liter or you can have a 2.9 liter. That just all depends. That's how much air is going into the engine. So the components. Here's an example of a supercharger on an engine. Supercharger is this at the top. You have a pulley in the front which turns the cylinders inside, which are these. That will then compress the air and it'll come out the bottom into the cylinders, which I'm about to show you. Here's the crankshaft that spins, and then the belts are what spins your pulley to spin your supercharger. So with that, you have to use energy to gain more power. So that's why they're less efficient than what you see in a turbocharger, because you're already using power created to create more power. Here's a GIF to kind of show you what it looks like. You have your intake where the air comes in, it goes through the supercharger, that compresses the air, and then forces it into the cylinders to get a bigger and better combustion. Here's a dyno truck for a supercharger. As you can see, compared to that turbo, it's much more linear. As the RPMs increase, the horsepower increases almost linearly compared to that gradual curve you saw in the turbocharger. So pros and cons of a supercharger. Same thing, increased horsepower and torque, instant torque and throttle response. As soon as you step on the gas, since it's belt driven, as the crankshaft spins faster, you're going to have direct relationship to the torque and power created. It's also easily installed. It's pretty much a bolt-on system. It's just that supercharger component, and you can just put it on top, and they're fairly cheap because of that, less components. Now the cons, it's less efficient than a turbocharger. You're going to have to use the crankshaft, basically spending energy to create more. Reliability, it's kind of like you can only put so much power into an engine without having to upgrade it, so it can be unreliable. And it cannot be used in smaller engines. Same deal with the efficiency, because you need to spin the supercharger from the engine. So if you have a small engine, it's not going to do it very well. And then as well, low boost. So that's just kind of an overview of what the two differences are. There's many different things to consider when choosing between the two, and that just depends on what you're using it for. So that's just an overview of what turbochargers versus superchargers are. Any questions?
Well, good apps need help.
Yeah, these are for just
No, not
any
these
questions
one,
that I have. I can show
the previous one, the dyno charger data, whatever that was. Yes, there you go. I can't see what it's next like. I can't see what's
I told them earlier when I talked about the.
Yeah, you should change those graphs.
Well, it's really hard to find just the power graph that really showed the differences between a turbo and a supercharger, because most of them have multiple different lines with different things going on. So I tried to find a simple version just to
You could
show.
have drawn this.
I could have, yeah.
Nobody's looking to see the exact numbers. All they want to see is some sort of.
Right. That's kind of what this one at the end was for, if I needed to explain it further.
Okay.
I'm just curious because I don't know much. Have they done anything to try to improve that lag for a turbo?
Yeah, so the thing with turbos is there's different sizes. The smaller the blades, the faster they can spin and the faster they'll spool up. So if you want an instant response, you can go to a smaller turbo, which will give you that more rapid response, but it makes less power, less boost, so it's kind of like a trade-off thing. So like diesels, they use smaller turbos to get, because they don't rev very high, so they can get more torque and power, low RPMs.
Could also spool it up beforehand.
Yeah, there's many different ways to get your turbos in boost before, but it's a whole lot. Yes.
Going to reducing turbo lag, Jeep actually has a new engine in the 4-cylinder of the new Wrangler. They use a mild hybrid system where they use e-torque to kind of combat the turbo lags. Basically, it provides electric power in that power gap between your throttle, when you hit the throttle and when the turbo kicks in, so that it seems like it reduces. It doesn't actually reduce the turbo lag. It just makes the drivers seem like there's no turbo lag.
And that's the 19s? 419s?
In addition to that, what a lot of companies do is they'll do it's two different. They'll do the twin turbo setup where they'll have one that's a smaller turbo, one that's a bigger turbo, and they'll set up timing to where when you're at low RPMs, just using the smaller one, and then advance to the bigger one. There's plenty of different ways to do turbos that are very complex systems. Whenever you get into it, superchargers are very simple. They do what they do, and that's about it. The turbo has a lot of room for improvement in a lot of different ways, for fuel economy, for power, for anything. It has a lot of versatility. Thank you.